thanks everybody for coming to my talk this morning. I'm Mikey Ilagan, a product manager at the Comcast accessibility team. You might also remember me from my days running the local site Geekadelphia and being one of the organizers behind the Philly Geek Awards. So,
we're in this nice little transition.
Alrighty. Before I get started though, I'm just gonna head and preface that my views are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of my employer. Just gonna put that out there, yada yada. So, in my role, I'm not, if you can't see the slides, that's me and my best friend and role model, Gritty. So, in my role, I'm not the product manager of a specific product per se, like something on our set-top box or, something, or one of our apps. I'm responsible for the customer experience and accessibility as it relates to several products. I work with teams to ensure that the technology we're building is compatible for people with a broad range of abilities. My background, however, is pretty much all manner of web, UI, UX, design. My title was UX developer once. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. And that's what I went to school for. That's what I spent most of my career doing, which is creating digital experiences. I'm very passionate about the way people interact with technology. Also, fun side fact, among my hobbies are seeing how often Philly Mag, technically Philly, and Billy Penn will quote me. I had written that already, and then both Philly Mag and Billy Penn earlier this week used one of my tweets, and that's working out perfectly. So after today, I hope you'll have a better understanding of our social responsibility to provide access, how to be more mindful of people, and how to empathize and take action. So the number one question that comes up often is, how did I get into accessibility? That's a good question with a somewhat boring answer. Many people know that I've been at Comcast for a while. It'll be 5 years this May. But before converting full-time, I was a UI developer with Think Company. About 2 years in, my contract as a developer came to an end, so many different opportunities opened up for me. One of them was staying with Think Company and pursuing a consulting position with Comcast. Another one, this time as an accessibility specialist. The way the role was originally conceived was a mix of software testing, quality assurance, and consulting. So as somebody with a diverse skill set and a range of experiences who had some accessibility experience and had already been working at Comcast for a while, I was a great fit for the job. I knew that I wanted to stay with Think and knew what to expect as a consultant at Comcast. So we applied for the position, and I got it. 2 years after that, Comcast expressed an interest in keeping me on a full-time basis, made an offer to convert me as a product manager, and the rest is history. That was 6 months ago. So I also wish I could come up here and tell you I always had an interest in accessibility. I was originally introduced to the concept as was framed under the concept of legal compliance. Back in school, one of our professors brought it up a few times, and I was like, all right, don't use the color red. Some people are colorblind, got it. People would throw around terms like the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Web Content, or WCAG, or WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And I never bothered to look into them more. I was ignorant and didn't even realize how much I was missing. I've noticed that people get into this industry in all sorts of ways. One of my colleagues came into this space because of his interest in disability rights. For other folks on the team, like me, it's due to their experiences in technology through design, software development, or testing. And for the rest, it's a topic that's close to home. They have a disability and are passionate about how people like them use and enjoy technology. So in the development of my career and as me as a person, I'd say I've had a few different milestones. At some point along the way, I decided to lean on my strengths. This meant giving up on trying to be a jack of all trades, master of none. I think this still broadly describes me, but I've learned a lot about letting go and focusing. One decision I made early on was to move away from visual design for everybody's benefit. I focused on front-end development for a while, which I was very passionate about for a time, still am, but even still, I felt for a number of years that passion had kind of tapered a bit. That's when I found accessibility and a newfound passion. I love accessibility because it intersects with things I've always been interested in, design and technology. I have to take into consideration things that are challenging for me or things I don't necessarily understand, like healthcare and law. Accessibility lives at the intersection of people and technology. That's where I live too. It's my home address, send mail. So that brings us to a couple overlapping topics. So I've found myself in a position where I'm constantly advocating for people with disabilities. I don't identify with one myself. Me, one Caucasian square away from non-disabled, white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, privilege, bingo. That's it. I'm lucky to work with people representative of the community that I'm advocating for. Not everyone is lucky enough to be in that position. However, we must use what privilege we have to elevate, empower, and enrich the lives of people who the system does not currently serve. That's how I've come to approach my work. I have diversity, inclusion, and accessibility up here because they all work together. And we really have to work, put in the work to achieve these things. You can't just say these terms over and over again like Beetlejuice and Bloody Mary and expect them to appear. In order to achieve diversity, we must be accessible. We must be inclusive. In order to be inclusive, we must be accessible. Diversity is a strength that many of us are striving for. Everyone says it. Diversity is important, if not essential, whether you're talking about biology or financial investments. In the context of people, however, in order to get there, we need to include every manner of nationalities, races, sexualities, genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities, and disabilities. In accessibility, we often talk about inclusion. But you cannot have inclusion without intersectionality. Unfortunately, there are no web guidelines for people of different races, sexualities, genders, and economic backgrounds. That's a quote I paraphrased from Matt May, head of inclusive design at Adobe. None of these topics are about checking individual boxes, even though they often get treated like it. I'm here today to talk about accessibility in the context that we usually talk about it, which is disability. But the work that I do in accessibility in this context doesn't represent the full topic of inclusion. It's just one part of it. So I once wrote that accessibility is the journey, but inclusion is the destination. However, looking back, there's many things we need to be mindful of on our journey to inclusion. We need to break down constructed barriers and inequities that are built into our system. We need to create experiences in a world where people don't have access but are truly comfortable, included, and heard. For all of human history, people have been left out, excluded, marginalized, discriminated, or worse. It's time to take, your little corner of it, whether you work in writing, design, technology, or something else, and do what we can and deconstruct the past. How do we include the full spectrum of human ability and experiences in the work that we do? How are we making sure people get to see themselves or people like them represented in the products and experiences we're creating or the communities that we're building? After you leave today, think about the people and things that your work currently excludes and how to include them. Realize, though, that's just the starting point. So, very light topic to start us off with. But to go a little bit into what is accessibility, specifically. In case you're sitting here thinking, I have no idea what accessibility is, but Mikey just said it every other word for 20 minutes, and I have no idea still. Good news, I'm going to talk about that. For starters, tech company Mozilla, makers of the Firefox browser, say, accessibility is the practice of making your websites usable by as many people as possible. Cool. That sounds good. I get it. The Web Accessibility Initiative, the ones who create the accessibility guidelines that we follow, tell us web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. To take a step back and broaden this concept, when we break down the word, it's capable of being reached, used, seen, understood, appreciated, or influenced, as written by Merriam-Webster in their dictionary. That's the rendition that I tend to associate with. Accessibility really is just the means of access. When we break down the word, it's the ability in which something can be accessed. This applies to both physical spaces and digital ones. This is what the word means even outside of the context of disability. We often talk about disability as it relates to accessibility, but everyone needs access. A common saying in this industry is that 1 of 5 people may have a disability, but if we're building products for people, then 5 out of 5 need access. It's just that access might look different depending on who you are. One analogy that I tend to use often is, it's like we're building the ramp to the internet. You'll notice that I tend to pull a lot of analogies from our physical spaces into our digital ones. Another common phrase in this industry is also that accessibility is essential for some, useful for all. Things that might be a convenience for some people, such as elevators, ramps, and curb cuts, are vital to the people who need them. These analogies also exist in the digital space. The problem is that it's easier to hide in a digital space, and nobody's going to prevent you from creating your problematic, inaccessible online storefront the way they would with your brick-and-mortar location. So when I describe what I do, people will sometimes ask me or think out loud, I'm not sure if my site, app, experience, project, space, etc. is accessible. And I hate to break it to you, but if you can't confidently answer that question, the answer is probably no. So a little bit more about what accessibility is and isn't. So accessibility isn't a list of restrictions. It won't force you to make a product that is cluttered, or ugly, or boring. It is or may be a list of requirements that need to be met so a wider range of people can fully experience the experiences that you're building. These requirements will give you new ideas to explore, and they'll even lead to better products for all of your users. Accessibility is sometimes special accommodations. That can be true. We have to add on access to old, complex systems. That's like adding ramps or separate accessible entrances onto older buildings. We see that often here in Philly, where we have a ramp like on the back of the Franklin Institute, or curb cuts that need to be put in where they weren't previously. Accessibility is great, inclusive, or universal design. If everything followed the philosophy of universal design, accessibility wouldn't be regarded as this separate entity or separate thing. Everything would just be inherently accessible. Accessibility isn't hindering most users to accommodate a minority. Considering accessibility makes a better experience all around. I recently heard someone say that accessibility compromises aesthetics. I have two reactions to that. So design has limitations, requirements, and constraints. If someone can't design for those factors, I'm not sure that's the fault of accessibility. Accessibility is usable by as many people as possible. Think about curb cuts for people in wheelchairs, but also think about people pulling wheeled luggage or pushing strollers or carts. Accessibility is a civil right, and those laws exist to uphold those civil rights. When you build experiences mindful of accessibility, you're maintaining the rights of others. When you don't, you deny them of that equality. Let's avoid accidental discrimination. Related but unrelated, think about like racist technology that wouldn't identify darker faces. Accessibility, and lastly, related to that previous point, accessibility is a shared social responsibility. When we work together, we'll find that the rising tide lifts all boats. So why accessibility? To cut to the chase, ask yourself, do people with disabilities deserve the same level of equality and access as everyone else? Depending on how you answer that question can really save us a lot of time. And then I can just leave on that note, I guess. So people want nothing more than to be treated equally. One of the ways I was introduced to accessibility, as I mentioned earlier, was preventing legal action. In my honest opinion, the fear of legal consequence and the price tag associated with it is what usually motivates people, especially large corporations, to get started. It's cheaper to avoid legal trouble now rather than having to go back and fix it and settling in court. So you're paying to settle in court and then having to do the work that you should have done to begin with. Compliance is also just the beginning, as I've mentioned. It doesn't represent usability, design, or a pleasant user experience. It's really just doing the bare minimum in terms of accessibility, and I'll get into that a little bit more. Accessibility offers other benefits. So coming from the perspective of a former developer, if you're interested in refactoring that legacy code base or making use of the newest technology, one way to get there is that you need to go into the code to make it more accessible. You could be going in there for other reasons too, such as performance. Security is huge these days, SEO even. Another way to look at the benefits that accessibility can offer is the opportunity to innovate or use new technology. You could create or utilize voice input somehow. That create another way for people to use what you're building, but also be innovative in the space. In 2015, Cornell reported that the percentage of people in the US with disabilities was 12.6%. That means about 40 million people of roughly 317.5 million individuals in the US reported one or more disabilities. They deserve to be your customers or user base just like anybody else. I have this complaint that I say often when I encounter bad design, like, I just want to give you my money, just take my money. Why do you make it so difficult? But my favorite point about this is that it's just the right thing to do. Ensuring accessibility gives us the ability to reach a broader, more diverse audience. Being mindful of this audience also allows us to create a better, more holistic user experience and improve our improve our goodwill for our fellow humans. We should do good for the sake of being good. How can we call ourselves designers if we're not designing for everyone? And on the note of everyone, who is our audience? According to some sources, up to 20% of the US population has one or more disabilities, as I mentioned. They're usually categorized into these 4 groups. Blindness and low vision, so this would include people with all forms of color blindness and visual impairment. These folks may have difficulty with certain color combinations. Some depend on screen magnification software or screen readers. And due to the very visual nature of digital technology, people with visual disabilities are often met with the greatest challenges. People who are deaf or hard of hearing have difficulty with audio content. For example, dialogue-heavy videos without closed captioning are tough to understand. We're gonna capture this video later, right? All right. Transcripts for audio are great for accessibility, but it's also a good example of something that allows those with cognitive disabilities to review the content. It even makes the content crawlable by search engines. It would even allow people in different markets to do a quick Google Translate of your content in their language. Neurodiversity, so people with cognitive disabilities of various origins, also known as the neurodiverse. They could have disabilities that affect their memory, attention, problem solving, and logic. This includes developmental disabilities, people who've had traumatic brain injuries, learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, and more. Within this category is also the entire autism spectrum. This audience needs to be included as well. Physical disabilities. People with difficulty or inability to use their hands or other parts of their body for any reason. This includes those with loss or lack of fine muscle control. Wheelchair users are in this category. Some depend on different technologies that replace the need for a keyboard or a mouse. And many people of these groups also depend on voice technology these days, so voice input. I wanted to talk about disability on a spectrum. So just like gender, sexuality, skin color, and life overall, disability is on a spectrum. None of these things are binary. How do we move beyond the binary? A person could be partially deaf or blind. They could be completely deaf or completely blind. They could be both or none. A person could be colorblind. There's spectrums within spectrums too. As I mentioned, within neurodiversity, we have the full autism spectrum, but there's also ADHD. This particular example from Microsoft shows us the similarities and differences across having one arm, which is a permanent state, having an arm injury, which is temporary, and doing something like holding a baby, which is completely situational. Which brings us to accessibility is for everyone. Accidents and illnesses could happen at any time, and the ultimate goal is that we'll all grow older, right? After accidents, illness, or a certain age, we can't expect our bodies to work the same way that they did previously. But fortunately, technology exists to cover the gap between our disabilities and the environment that we exist in. So there's a wide range of assistive technology out there that exists to aid people in their daily lives. This can be as simple as the same computer keyboard that you and I use to fancier, less common, and much more expensive equipment such as braille readers. Devices can be a bit more utilitarian, such as switch devices, which basically allow people to kind of navigate and activate controls on a site or app. Depending on the person, though, a broad range of technology exists to aid them in their technology. There's hardware such as sip and puff switches, which I like to call more appropriately a mouth joystick. So if I ever build one, I'll just call it a mouth joystick because that's what it does. Eye tracking software, screen readers which verbalize all written content and the entire interface on the screen, and dictation software that not only transcribes spoken word but interprets voice commands. A question that comes up sometimes is how many users of these particular technologies exist. To me, even asking that question can get a bit problematic. That's not like asking or thinking about PC versus Mac or Chrome versus IE. When the technology people use is so inherently tied to their identity, you can't really, I mean, you can make that comparison, but not really. So it's easy to discriminate against like 10% of all IE users, right? If you only have 10% of Internet Explorer users. Since they could feasibly update their technology, they're not stuck with it forever. However, in many cases, people's disabilities could be part of their identity. This example might be a stretch, but you would never say you're cutting out 10% of Asian Americans. I would be very sad. But while these tools are tied to their identity, they don't define the people. Allow me to elaborate a little bit further. So when Hawking died, the media fell into some pretty old cliches about wheelchair users. They said he was wheelchair bound or that he was confined to a wheelchair. Wheelchairs are a tool. They're a mobility tool. If anything, wheelchairs and other assistive technology are freeing to those with disabilities. It's a tool of freedom, and without the wheelchair, that's when people are seriously limited. Assistive technology empowers people. So I spent most of my life wearing prescription lenses, and no one would have ever defined me as bound to my prescription lenses. This is a perspective that needs to be reframed, pun intended. So I often begin many of my other accessibility tech talks by asking a simple question. Is accessibility your responsibility? Yes, it is. But to tie it to the overall theme and to expand this idea a bit further, does the responsibility of inclusion fall on those who are already marginalized? No. So obviously not. So, and I hope the following slides will kind of explain why. So the following are facsimiles of conversations I've had with people in the past few years since I've been working in the accessibility space. My perspective has completely changed. So when I hear some of these objections to accessibility work, I can't help but hear them in certain ways. So let me share some. I didn't know this had to be accessible. So in other words, I didn't know this had to work. So what's the point of designing if we aren't designing for as many people as we can, as I mentioned earlier? Designing for accessibility may be the only way some people can experience what you've built. Once again, accessibility is essential for some, but useful for all. So other people will say, we know it's important, but our customers won't pay for accessibility. What I tend to hear is, we think accessibility is a separate feature for specific people. When something is designed universally, it benefits everyone. I mentioned curb cuts earlier and how they were made for people in wheelchairs, but think about the benefits for strollers, carts, et cetera. Closed captioning was invented for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but I just have text on my screen all the time, It makes it possible to listen in noisy bars or in situations where you need to be a little, quieter. So on to my next example. How do we get this to pass compliance? And I have feelings about that. We'll build the very best product we can for most people, but when it comes to the people who need us the most, let's do the minimum. Compliance is just meeting the minimum legal required threshold. So if you don't normally do that in your work, why are you doing it for people with disabilities? Is this really an issue? Fun times. This problem doesn't affect the majority. Should I be concerned with the minority? And to put it another way, how many people does this affect really? Or is this an edge case? If you can't acknowledge or understand there is a problem, it doesn't make that problem go away. And defining edge cases is also kind of just setting the boundaries or parameters on what you care about. This one is definitely from software development land. I had another one like this, but I decided to cut it out for your sake. This feature is going away soon. Do we have to fix it? And if this were any other high priority issue affecting most other users, we'd fix it. If the site were down, we'd fix it. If the site's completely inaccessible to screen reader users, it's like, nah. That's what I hear. So every day an issue lives out there in the wild is another day that you're assuming risk. Until you've cleared a path, people must live with the obstruction that you've left in their way, or move on to something better designed to suit their needs. And so for my long Lord of the Rings conclusion, let's empathize with other people who have a broad range of different experiences and abilities, but remember, you can't get by on empathy without action. Empathy by itself won't get rid of ableism or any kind of discrimination. Everyone talks about empathy in design and technology, but what good is empathy without action? If we're not acting on empathy and breaking down the systemic conditions that inhibit it, then what good is empathy alone? You can't, empathize racism away. Let's consider who we might be forgetting, and how they interact with technology, and how they want to see themselves in the things that we're building or the spaces that we're creating. Let's equip ourselves with tools and training. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, it turns out. A lot of accessibility stuff, too. You don't have to Slack me, but you can. You can equip yourselves with the knowledge to aid yourself in design, development, and testing. There's so many resources out there to educate yourselves and make ourselves better. Let's research and evaluate high priorities. Goals will be a lot easier to accomplish if you break them down. Get everyone involved. This isn't any one person's job. Much of the failings that I see are because people don't share this responsibility. We saddle developers with it. We saddle designers with it. We saddle our accessibility team with it. If anything, people are constantly trying to shift being accountable to accessibility. Most importantly, however, try to involve the voices of the actual people that you're building for. Include people with disabilities in your process. And then be a part of positive cultural change, which seems ironic in our current state, but I'm going to say it anyway. Accessibility is so much more than screen readers, alt text, guidelines, the entire web, digital experience, or technology as a whole. It's about people. It's about how we treat one another. And then lastly, for me, fight for equality and inclusion. That's how we'll really get things done. Thank you.